Cambodia, a country known for its ancient and rich history, was once the home of the mighty Khmer Empire. In its prime, the empire controlled much of Southeast Asia, and the remains of its civilization, like the temples of Angkor Wat, stand as a testament to its past greatness. But by the time the Khmer Rouge rose to power in the 1970s, Cambodia's journey had been shaped by centuries of foreign influence, internal struggles, and external conflicts. The history of Cambodia before the Khmer Rouge is one of constant change and challenge. After the fall of the Khmer Empire, the country faced constant pressure from neighboring nations and colonial powers. From the 16th century onward, Cambodia was often caught in the middle of larger regional conflicts, particularly between Thailand and Vietnam, two neighboring powers that sought to dominate Southeast Asia. This made Cambodia vulnerable and left it without the strength to defend its sovereignty. In the mid-19th century, Cambodia became a French colony. The French presence in Cambodia, which lasted for nearly 100 years, brought significant changes to the country. Under French rule, the Cambodian people faced heavy taxation and a suppression of their cultural and political autonomy. While some modern infrastructure was built, such as roads and schools, much of it was designed to benefit the French colonial empire rather than the local population. However, the French colonization also planted the seeds for Cambodia's future independence. The resentment that grew from foreign control gave rise to national movements, some inspired by the communist revolutions happening in other parts of the world, especially in neighboring Vietnam. By the early 20th century, the Cambodian population had become more politically aware and eager to regain their independence. In 1954, Cambodia finally achieved independence from France. Prince Norodom Sihanouk, a popular leader at the time, became the king and sought to assert Cambodia's sovereignty on the world stage. However, Cambodia's newfound independence did not bring peace. The country found itself caught in the crossfire of the Cold War, as global powers such as the United States and the Soviet Union sought to expand their influence in Southeast Asia. The Vietnam War, which raged to Cambodia's east, spilled over into Cambodian territory. The US began bombing parts of Cambodia, hoping to destroy North Vietnamese supply lines. This bombing campaign, which lasted from 1970 to 1973, devastated large areas of Cambodia, killing tens of thousands of civilians and displacing even more. This bombing campaign, along with the chaos of the Vietnam War, created the conditions in which radical movements could thrive. Among these movements was the Khmer Rouge, a communist group led by a man named Pol Pot. The Khmer Rouge had been growing since the early 1960s, gaining support from rural Cambodians who were disillusioned by the government's inability to protect them from the foreign invasion. The bombing raids only strengthened the Khmer Rouge's narrative that Cambodia needed to be purged of foreign influence and returned to a simpler, more pure way of life. The Khmer Rouge promised to restore Cambodia's former glory by returning to an agrarian society, free from the corruption they believed was introduced by Western influences. They used the anger and fear caused by the US bombing to attract support, especially among rural communities that had been most affected. Their appeal was rooted in the idea of purifying the nation, and they used radical nationalist rhetoric to gain followers. The Khmer Rouge portrayed themselves as the defenders of Cambodian culture, promising to rid the country of everything they saw as foreign, corrupt, or capitalist. In 1970, a coup led by General Lon Nol overthrew Prince Sihanouk, who had been attempting to maintain Cambodia's neutrality in the regional conflict. The coup set off a civil war between the Khmer Rouge, who had the support of the rural peasants, and the Lon Nol government, which was supported by the United States. This war would prove to be a turning point for Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge gained even more support from people who had been loyal to Sihanouk and his ideals of national sovereignty. They saw the coup as a betrayal of the country's independence, and so they rallied to the Khmer Rouge cause. With the United States continuing its bombing campaign and the government of Lon Nol growing increasingly unpopular, the Khmer Rouge grew stronger. They expanded their influence throughout the countryside, and by April 17, 1975, they captured the capital city of Phnom Penh. The fall of Phnom Penh marked the end of the Civil War, but it was also the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in Cambodia's history. The Khmer Rouge, having overthrown the government, immediately began implementing their vision for the country. They declared the start of Year Zero, an effort to erase everything from the past. Everything that symbolized Cambodia's old life was deemed corrupt and must be eliminated. Urban populations were forcibly relocated to the countryside to work in labor camps. The cities were emptied, and the people who once lived in them were now subject to forced labor and re-education programs. The radical changes they made were part of a broader, disastrous effort to return to what they called the Golden Age of Cambodia. They envisioned a classless agrarian society where all citizens would work the land. The intellectuals, the educated, and anyone with ties to the old regime were viewed as threats to this vision and were targeted for elimination. The Khmer Rouge was determined to create a society free from foreign influence, from education, from religion, and from the very structures that had once defined Cambodia. As the Khmer Rouge tightened their grip on the country, the true extent of their brutality became apparent. People were forced into hard labor under horrific conditions. Starvation, disease, and executions became part of everyday life. The regime carried out systematic purges, targeting anyone they deemed a traitor or enemy of the revolution. These purges, along with the mass displacement of people and the collapse of Cambodia's society, would lead to the deaths of nearly 2 million people. In the years that followed, the world would come to know this dark period in Cambodian history as the Killing Fields. But the story of the Killing Fields did not begin with the mass executions or the horrors of daily life under the Khmer Rouge. It began much earlier, with the historical struggles of a nation caught in the grip of foreign domination and internal division. The roots of the Killing Fields can be traced back to the complex history of Cambodia, a history filled with conflict, colonialism, and political turmoil. The Khmer Rouge exploited these historical factors to create the conditions that would ultimately lead to one of the most horrific genocides of the 20th century. After the Khmer Rouge seized control of Cambodia on April 17, 1975, the country plunged into a nightmare. The new rulers, under the leadership of Pol Pot, declared the beginning of Year Zero. This was not just a political slogan. It was a radical attempt to erase the country's entire history, its institutions, and its culture in an effort to create a pure agrarian society. The Khmer Rouge believed that by stripping away everything from the past, they could create a society free of the corruption they saw as the result of foreign influences, capitalism, and education. For the Khmer Rouge, the ideal society was one where everyone worked the land and all citizens were equal. This vision, however, was not based on any understanding of how to govern a modern nation, nor was it in any way practical. Instead, it was a harsh, unrealistic dream of returning Cambodia to a supposed golden age before the influence of Western powers. Under Pol Pot's leadership, the Khmer Rouge turned this vision into a policy that caused immense suffering for the Cambodian people. One of the first acts of the Khmer Rouge was to begin the forced evacuation of Cambodia's cities. Phnom Penh, the capital, had a population of more than 2 million, many of whom had fled to the city to escape the violence of the Civil War. But when the Khmer Rouge took over, they emptied the city within days. All urban residents, regardless of their age or health, were forced to leave their homes and walk to the countryside. This was done under the belief that city life was decadent and corrupt. The people of Phnom Penh were subjected to harsh conditions during their forced march. They had no food or water, and many died along the way due to exhaustion, disease, or starvation. This mass relocation was not just about clearing the cities. It was part of the Khmer Rouge's broader goal of transforming Cambodia into a rural, agrarian society. They wanted to eliminate any remnants of urban culture, any structures of governance, and any educated people who might challenge their authority. The idea was to create a classless society, one where everyone was involved in agriculture. Intellectuals, professionals, teachers, doctors, and anyone seen as part of the old system were particularly targeted. They were seen as the enemies of the revolution, and they would be either killed or forced into labor camps. The Khmer Rouge's vision for society was one where all citizens would work the land, grow rice, and be completely self-sufficient. The regime took over all aspects of life, controlling everything from what people ate to whom they could marry. Private property was abolished and money was eliminated. People were made to live in collective labor camps, where they were forced to work long hours for little or no food. These labor camps were overcrowded and the conditions were harsh. The Khmer Rouge imposed a strict hierarchy, where only those who were loyal to the regime and had proven their worth in the fields could be trusted with any authority. While the Khmer Rouge leaders claimed that their policies were in the interest of the people, they were in fact causing immense harm. The forced labor, combined with food shortages and the lack of medical care, led to widespread disease and death. The Khmer Rouge had no regard for human life, and anyone who showed weakness or was unable to work was either executed or left to die from malnutrition or illness. Families were torn apart as the regime separated men, women, and children, assigning them to different work brigades. The most extreme aspect of the Khmer Rouge's Year Zero was the systematic elimination of anyone they considered an enemy. This included not just government officials or military personnel, but also ordinary citizens who were deemed a threat because of their education, their background, or their connections to the old regime. Thousands of people were executed in mass purges that swept across the country. The Khmer Rouge had no legal system or trials, and people were killed on the basis of suspicion alone. They set up torture centers, where prisoners were interrogated, tortured, and killed. One of the most infamous of these centers was the S-21 prison in Phnom Penh, where an estimated 17,000 people were held, tortured, and executed. Very few survived, and the prison has since been turned into a museum that serves as a stark reminder of the brutality of the regime. The Khmer Rouge also targeted religious groups, ethnic minorities, and anyone they considered to be impure or corrupted. Buddhists, who were the majority religious group in Cambodia, were seen as a threat because of their ties to the old Cambodian culture. Monks were defrocked, temples were destroyed, and Buddhist teachings were banned. Minority groups, such as the Vietnamese, Chinese, and Cham Muslims, were persecuted and killed in large numbers. The Cham, for example, were particularly targeted, with up to 70% of their population killed. This intense persecution was not limited to urbanites or intellectuals. It also affected ordinary people in the countryside, who were subjected to forced labor and harsh living conditions. Those who were deemed to be counter-revolutionary or who had any connection to the old regime were executed. Entire villages were wiped out, and the killing fields, as these mass graves became known, are now a chilling reminder of the scale of the genocide. The Khmer Rouge's radical policies also had a profound psychological impact on the people of Cambodia. Fear was a constant part of daily life. Neighbors were encouraged to spy on one another, and families were forced to betray each other. The regime used children, often indoctrinated at a young age, as spies and informants. The Khmer Rouge created a culture of suspicion, where anyone could be denounced as a traitor at any moment. This atmosphere of fear and paranoia permeated every aspect of life under the regime. Despite the immense suffering and loss of life, the Khmer Rouge did not consider their actions to be atrocities. They believed that their violent policies were justified by their ideological goals. They viewed their radical transformation of Cambodia as a necessary step to cleanse the nation of its perceived sins and to create a new, utopian society. But in reality, their policies led to the deaths of approximately 1/4 of Cambodia's population. This included not just those killed directly by the regime, but also those who died from starvation, disease, and overwork. The devastation left in the wake of the Khmer Rouge's rule would take generations to recover from. When the Khmer Rouge finally fell in 1979, after Vietnam invaded Cambodia, the country was left in ruins. The regime's radical experiment had failed miserably, and the Cambodian people were left to rebuild their shattered nation. However, the scars of the genocide would remain for many years to come. The Khmer Rouge's reign was one of the darkest periods in modern history, and it serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of radical ideologies and the consequences of unchecked power. When the Khmer Rouge regime finally ended in 1979, Cambodia was left in ruins. The country had been ravaged by 4 years of unimaginable violence, and the Cambodian people were left to pick up the pieces. The fall of the Khmer Rouge came at the hands of the Vietnamese, who invaded Cambodia after escalating tensions between the two countries. The Vietnamese military easily overwhelmed the Khmer Rouge, capturing Phnom Penh on January 7, 1979. This marked the end of the Khmer Rouge's reign of terror, but it also opened a new chapter of uncertainty for Cambodia. After the collapse of the Khmer Rouge, Cambodia faced the difficult task of rebuilding its society. The country had suffered immense losses, both in terms of human lives and its cultural heritage. The education system had been decimated, with nearly all of the country's teachers and intellectuals executed. The healthcare system was in shambles, as doctors, nurses, and medical staff had been targeted and killed. The economy had been destroyed, and many people had been displaced or forced into labor camps. The survivors of the Khmer Rouge regime faced not only physical scars but psychological wounds that would take decades to heal. In the aftermath of the genocide, the Cambodian government, with the help of the international community, began the difficult process of recovery. The Vietnamese-installed government in Cambodia, known as the People's Republic of Kampuchea, sought to stabilize the country. However, the Cambodian people were deeply divided, and the new government was seen by many as a foreign occupation force. Resistance movements, including remnants of the Khmer Rouge, continued to wage guerrilla warfare in the countryside, complicating efforts to rebuild. As Cambodia struggled with its internal divisions and the ongoing conflict, the international community began to turn its attention to the atrocities committed by the Khmer Rouge. For years, there was little accountability for the crimes of the regime. The Cold War played a significant role in this lack of justice. During the 1970s and 80s, the Khmer Rouge continued to receive support from China, and many Western countries, including the United States, were reluctant to confront the regime's crimes. Instead, they were focused on the broader geopolitical struggle against communism in Southeast Asia. The Khmer Rouge even retained Cambodia's seat at the United Nations until 1993, despite their responsibility for one of the worst genocides of the 20th century. It was not until the 1990s, after the end of the Cold War, that international pressure mounted for accountability. In 1991, the United Nations brokered a peace agreement between Cambodia's various factions, which included former Khmer Rouge leaders. This agreement led to the establishment of the United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia, UNTAC, which helped oversee the country's first free elections in 20 years. Despite these efforts, however, the Khmer Rouge's influence remained strong, and it was not until the Khmer Rouge was militarily defeated in the early 1990s that true justice began to take shape. The Khmer Rouge Tribunal, officially known as the Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia, ECCC, was established in 2006 with the goal of prosecuting senior leaders of the regime for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. The tribunal was a joint effort between the Cambodian government and the United Nations, and it aimed to bring those responsible for the atrocities of the killing fields to justice. The process was slow and faced numerous challenges, including a lack of resources, political interference, and accusations of corruption. However, it marked an important step toward healing for the Cambodian people and for the international community. Over the years, the tribunal has convicted several key figures of the Khmer Rouge. In 2009, the first case against Kaing Guek Ev, the head of the notorious S21 prison, resulted in a conviction for crimes against humanity. In 2016, Khieu Samphan, the former head of state of the Khmer Rouge, and Nuon Chea, the regime's chief ideologue, were both convicted of genocide and sentenced to life in prison. These trials, while significant, have been met with mixed reactions. Some survivors of the Khmer Rouge era see them as an important step toward justice, while others feel that the process has been too slow and that many of the regime's perpetrators have never been held accountable. The legacy of the Khmer Rouge continues to haunt Cambodia today. The country has made significant progress in rebuilding its economy and society, but the scars of the genocide are still deeply felt. The trauma of the killing fields has been passed down through generations, and many survivors continue to live with the psychological effects of their experiences. The Cambodian government has made efforts to preserve the memory of the genocide, with memorials such as the Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum and the killing fields at Choyong Ek serving as somber reminders of the atrocities committed by the Khmer Rouge. These sites have become important educational tools, not just for Cambodians, but for visitors from around the world, helping to ensure that the horrors of the past are never forgotten. In addition to memorializing the victims, Cambodia has also undertaken efforts to promote reconciliation. Several organizations, including the Cambodian Genocide Program and the Documentation Center of Cambodia, have worked to collect testimonies from survivors, preserve documents, and educate future generations about the genocide. Through these efforts, Cambodia hopes to heal the wounds of the past and build a more peaceful and prosperous future. The international community also has a crucial role in ensuring that the lessons of the Cambodian genocide are not forgotten. In the years since the Khmer Rouge's fall, there has been increased awareness of the dangers of genocide and the importance of preventing such atrocities from happening again. The Cambodian genocide serves as a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked political power, radical ideologies, and the failure of the international community to act in the face of mass atrocities. In conclusion, the real story behind the killing fields of Cambodia is not just one of terror and suffering, but also one of survival, resilience, and hope. Despite the immense loss and destruction caused by the Khmer Rouge, the Cambodian people have shown remarkable strength in rebuilding their country and in seeking justice for the crimes committed during this dark period in their history. The pursuit of justice, the remembrance of the victims, and the efforts to prevent future genocides are ongoing, and they remain a vital part of Cambodia's journey towards healing. The legacy of the killing fields will never be forgotten, and the world must continue to learn from Cambodia's history to ensure that such horrors are never repeated.